Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. A podcast where we make experts great again and we contribute actively to the public debate and policy making around commodities, the geopolitics of energy, and trade. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. Today we're going to talk about Qatar, a country worth watching with almost, I believe in the latest figures, $424 billion in sovereign wealth fund. Doha holds considerable soft power in global diplomacy, finance, charities, and education. But to understand Qatar's influence, you first need to understand where that money comes from and whether that war chest is likely to grow in the coming years. Like other Gulf countries, Qatar talks about diversifying its economy away from fossil fuels. But for now, over 83% of its revenues still come from hydrocarbons and mostly liquefied natural gas, LNG. And this dependency is likely to deepen as Qatar undertakes one of the world's largest LNG expansion with growing export capacity. That brings me to one of the biggest questions that I will be watching in the coming years is what's the future of the US-Qatar relationship? They are the two world's largest LNG exporter today, and both are expanding, almost doubling each their export capacity by the early 2030s. And those new volumes come at a time where we're likely to be in an oversupplied market. So for me, are we going to head towards collusion or collision between Washington and Qatar? The collusion scenario for me is the Yalta of gas, where basically there is an understanding between the two powers where each claims its own sphere of influence. Qatar keeps Asia, the US keeps the Atlantic. But I'm very cautious with this vision because they both have a very different model. Qatar Energy is one single state-owned company. The US is a diversity of multiple private actors that each have their interests and strategies, capitalistic. But de facto, this division is already happening today. Driven by the war in Ukraine, where most of US LNG headed to Europe, and also the disruptions on the shipping and maritime side, where Qatar gas, LNG, is mostly in Asia right now. And for this scenario to work, we need continued instability in the Red Sea, where it limits competition between the US and Qatar in Asia. And also, we need Russian gas to stay on the sideline. But this scenario is the one that Qatar prefers because it prevents the US and Qatar to be on complete frontal confrontation on the economic and commercial side. The other scenario is a market share war that I see, the collision one. And in this case, because we're likely in a glut, both like the molecules from the US and Qatar will desperately need to find a home, and they will compete at any cost in each and every market. So this is some of the issues we're going to explore today, and I'm delighted to have as a guest Ira Joseph, who is a senior research associate at the Center of Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, a longtime observer and analyst on pricing, generating fuels, and the electric power. Hi, Ira. Thanks for joining the Energy Vista podcast.
Hi, Leslie. This is really exciting for me and a great introduction there. I'm not sure I have anything left to say after that. That was fantastic.
So it's October. It's October 31, 2025, and time for a new Vista episode. So we're going to talk, as I mentioned, about Qatar. You co-authored with Anne-Sophie Carbo a very good paper that is still fresh from the oven. It was published in September on Qatar's LNG decisions and how it will impact the oversupplied market. And actually, you're going into different scenarios in this paper. Um, so you have your own scenarios in there. But one of the main questions for me, I was mentioning this big sovereign wealth fund that Qatar has, over $424 billion. Is this wealth fund going to expand even more with more revenues from the exports? Or is it going to be challenged by a more difficult market and more competition from other suppliers, including the US?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the wealth fund, it will keep getting wealthier, and it will continue to grow. I just think the we're kind of phasing out of like one period in LNG history here and phasing into another. We're kind of phasing out of the post-Russian invasion of Ukraine period, where we have the $10 to $12 gas in Europe and Asia, and the, let's say, $2 to $3 gas, $3.50 gas in the U.S., and massive margins and huge amounts of money being made by sellers of LNG. And we're entering this new period, which you mentioned, and as you know, is a big 50% increase in overall LNG supply and LNG capacity over the next 5 years. So in each of the next 5 years, there's going to be more LNG supply entering the market in each of the next 5 years than in any year in the history of the LNG business other than two. So we're talking about a massive amount of supply coming into the market. And really, for me, almost the only way to see it, and I've certainly tried to game out other scenarios as you're talking about here, is that the price of TTF and JKM are going to come down and the price of Henry Hub is going to go up. And we're going to sort of, get towards a price that's, different prices where we're kind of in the middle of where we are now. Now, how much does that affect the Qataris? So right now, the Qataris have all of their LNG under long-term contract that already exists, so the 77 million tons. Most, if not all of that, is oil indexed in one way or another. So the price of Brent really matters more to them now than the price of any of the spot benchmarks around them world for gas. But that's going to shift, over time, because as we have talked about, and as we certainly talked about in the paper, most of the LNG that Qatar is about to bring online, either the first expansion that's going to happen between now and the end of next year is 33 million tons, and only about 10 of that is under long-term contract. And then the next two expansions, which aren't under FID, but we expect to go forward, none of that LNG has been signed to anyone at all. So Qatar has this massive amount of LNG that's coming into the market between what's going to be in the Qatar and then, of course, Golden Pass, which is also starting up in the U.S. and is also their responsibility. So let's just roughly call it 50 million tons of LNG are coming into the market. Let's say less than 10 have been signed under long-term contract. And we have absolutely no idea what the Qataris are going to do here with this LNG. It's an unprecedented situation for them. I'm sure it will enter the market in one way or another, but unless they're about to sign a huge number of contracts that we don't know about, they signed one just the other day for 1 million tons, but 1 million isn't 50 million. We have no idea what's going to happen, and that really is what makes the LNG market so exciting now. Is that we're really entered into this completely unknown period of time, where this sort of the country, the most traditional LNG seller in the world, who sells LNG in one way, has to now completely pivot and sell LNG in a way that we've never seen before. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. So, once their expansion is completed, at least the first phase,
Yeah.
um, I saw some numbers from Bloomberg, I think, mentioning that it could add about 30 billion annually to the state revenue. But from what you're mentioning, and I agree, it depends on so many different factors, including the oil price, demand also. And
Yeah.
right now, Qatar is sending about 25% of its LNG to China. China is a big uncertainty also as a gas market in the future. So right now they are generating about 115 billion, or it declined, I think, in recent years. So 115 billion was in 2022 when the gas price was at its highest level following the war in Ukraine. It declined a little bit in 2023. I'm not sure what the latest number for 2024 and 2025, but let's say that on a yearly basis, Qatar is currently generating more than 80 billions a year in export revenue from LNG. But a lot of uncertainty again for the coming years. So in the scenario where gas prices, as you mentioned, decline, let's say we're in an environment of $6 per million BTU, maybe five, maybe
Mhm.
four. Um, who is the best position between Qatar and the US?
In a low price environment like that, I mean, I think Qatar is in a good position there because they do have all of their LNG currently sold under long-term contract from the existing trains. So,
From the existing one.
if the spot price drops to 5 or 6, which or that kind of range, there nothing's going to affect them from those trains. Now, the expansion, let's say the 32 million ton expansion, could be affected, obviously. But I mean, I've always thought because Qatar is the world's low cost producer and they're kicking off so much oil and NGLs with it anyway. There's no way I can really realistically see them shutting in production. And even if they had to sell that LNG at cost, which is a really low cost, or even below cost, there's so much money being kicked off from between the crude and the liquids that I don't think it really affects them the way it affects the U.S. In U.S. in a low price environment is one of two things has to happen: either LNG export capacity has to get shut in, or U.S. gas production has to get shut in. One of those two things is likely to happen in this scenario because they just, if we do get down to $6 per million BTU, that's cutting it real close. If you have to factor in, the price of Henry Hub plus the markup to liquefy it and the shipping, et cetera, to kind of a break even, and so that puts the U.S. in I think kind of the swing position for the market going forward,
Mhm.
assuming that everything comes online and the market has to grow. But to absorb that amount of gas in that short a period of time when we haven't really seen the corresponding type of investment on the demand side in actually consuming this gas, you have to get to down to a price point that's really going to have to incentivize demand in places that we normally don't see. Obviously, India would be the biggest example of that, given how underutilized their gas capacity is in the power generation sector, but also in other areas as well. So
Yeah,
it's not impossible. It's
yeah.
just that, excuse me, more LNG is going to mean lower prices.
Hmm. Yeah,
Excuse me.
yeah, and I remember that during COVID, we saw some shut-in US LNG exports, cancellation of cargoes, and the US were the first ones to cut their exports.
Yeah, I think it was like 75 cargoes. Is kind of the number, but it was significant. It also led to a reduction in U.S. gas production again because you cut that amount of volume coming out of the U.S. That's going to have almost an immediate impact on Henry Hub down to levels where break even costs in a lot of gas production areas just are not met, and then production eventually has to be shut in. So
Yeah,
the interplay between LNG exports and U.S. gas production is a really fascinating aspect of it.
yeah. And also, even when there are long-term contracts, whether it's in Qatar or in the US, the fact that US LNG contracts are much more flexible means that they are the ones that will shut in first.
It seems that way, yeah. That
Yeah.
that that is certainly my assumption going forward, and I would recommend that would be assumption for most people that's exactly what can happen.
Yeah. So you mentioned India, you mentioned opening new markets as a potential strategy for Qatar.
Yeah,
Also, Qatar's commercial strategy is we cannot separate it from its diplomatic, its diplomacy and foreign policy.
sure.
Um, and in the past, Qatar has done a lot of government to government deals, whether it's Pakistan, Bangladesh, or other. Do you see it as a strategy also in the future to strike new deals, new long-term agreements, and basically sell more gas to some of the countries, maybe in Southeast Asia also, or the Middle East?
I think that's exactly what they've been trying to do. They've just been terribly, unsuccessful in doing it. I mean, you've seen the new the 10 million ton Abu Dhabi project, sign up contracts. You've seen a lot of U.S. LNG projects sign up new long-term contracts, but the Qataris, up until this week, when they signed the 1 million ton contract with an Indian buyer, just haven't been able to sign any contracts. And I think they're trying to defend a price that really, it seems to me, is indefensible at this time. I mean, obviously they can go lower, and I think they can move the gas. And I think if logic dictates, that's exactly what's going to happen: is that they're going to have to move the slope price down, particularly for countries like Bangladesh and poorer countries in Asia, because the threshold to bring in that kind of LNG and burn it without heavily subsidizing the gas is going to be really, really difficult. But I think that's exactly what happens in the end, is that at the end of the day, they're just going to have to discount the gas in order to move it. And they're going to have to really discount it in order to get it under a long-term contract. So we'll see.
Mhm. So in this case, it would bring really US LNG molecules and Qatari molecules on a market share war.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think your premise that you led with, it was collusion or what? I can't remember. It was the two C's. What
Yeah,
was it?
collusion or collision.
Or collision, yes. I think that collusion is going to be more than collision, although not really collusion. I think what you're right. I think when the market sort of settles towards transportation differentials around the world between the main markets, and those are the differentials that'll establish with the global prices in a $2 to $3 range. I think most U.S. LNG is going to go to Europe, and I think most Qatari LNG is going to go to Asia. I just think that's sort of the logical trade route for them, and what really makes the most amount of sense, for a period of time. Obviously, in the winter, there's going to be some movement around, but I mean, you already see, Qatar exports like between 300 and 350 million cubic meters a day right now, and now less than 50 of that is going to Europe, and that's been happening over the past 2 years. Part of that has to do with the corporate sustainability initiative. Part of that has to do with just better prices in Europe for them. Part of that has to do with the Suez Canal, as you mentioned. And I think part of that has to do with Golden Pass is about to start up. And while, that's US based LNG, it is their LNG. And I think all of it's going to go to Northwest Europe, where they have import capacity to take it. And I think so shifting the Qatari LNG to Asia and their US equity to Europe is really part of the broader strategy, which, by the way, none of the Golden Pass LNG is also under long-term contract. But of course, they do have access to the European market through Zeebrugge, and always forget which terminal in Europe. I think it's Isle of Grain in the UK. Gives them kind of a, for lack of a better metaphor, an LNG pipeline into the Northwest European spot market, which is good enough and kind of substitutes for having a long-term contract.
No, I definitely agree. Golden Pass to Europe and the rest of the Qatari LNG from Qatar to Asia would be optimal for Qatar. It will also prevent them really from being on the head-to-head competition with the US. And here we need to talk about the geopolitics. Qatar really needs the US as a security guarantor and has, over the years cultivated relationship with key US companies like Conoco, Exxon, also in part because they think it will help them with their security guarantees. But so it's not in Qatar's geopolitical interest to be too much on a commercial war with the US. So for them, the best would be to tacitly agree on dividing the markets, like a Yalta for gas, where the US keeps Europe and the Atlantic basin, and Qatar keeps Asia and the other emerging markets in the region, including the Middle East or something like that. And the shipping routes here, like for me from the beginning, and Qatar had in the past relationship with the Houthi, I think it didn't really help with like solving any of the issue in the Red Sea. I think it really plays actually in the interest of Qatar to for the US to have a longer route to go to Asia. And we have on top of that the issues with the Panama Canal. And in addition to that, we had the Houthi attacking tankers and basically having all the LNG tankers going the long route around the Cape of Good Hope. So whether it's Qatar or the US, it's a longer route either for the US to go to Asia or for Qatar to go to Europe. And as you mentioned, like right now, if you look at the whole European gas imports, so LNG and pipeline, Qatar is only 4% of
Yeah.
those imports.
Yeah.
compared to the US, which is about 17% now.
Right. And they're only 15% of their exports are going to Europe. I just looked it up as we were talking here. So it's a tiny amount. And listen, at the end of the day, Qatar can make more money and sell at a lower price into Asia than the US ever can. So
Hmm.
again, higher net back at a lower price into Asia all day long. So they can really cause a problem for US marketers in Asia. Now, like of course, a lot of US projects, there's like 35, 40 million tons of LNG that's contracted to China. What's going to end up happening is that a lot of that's going to end up going to Europe, but it is contracted to China, and it is sort of part of like this sort of weird equation we have to solve for between where the LNG is contracted and where it's actually going to go.
Mm.
And then of course there's the issue of the aggregator and portfolio volumes, which make up probably 40% of the entire growth that we're seeing here. And we have no idea where that's going to go, because essentially what's happened is that all the risk has been shifted from the sellers to the middlemen in terms of the
Yeah.
LNG, and that also, along with the uncontracted Qatari LNG, really sort of has to redefine how LNG is going to be traded in the future in ways that we it's going to be really difficult to assess at this point.
Very interesting. You mentioned also like your Qatar strategy in Europe and their opposition to the European corporate sustainability directive.
Yep.
And I was very surprised to see that the Department of Energy released a letter last week, uh, authored by the Secretary Chris Wright and Qatari Minister Al Kabi, who is also the head of Qatar Energy. Um, and what surprised me is for the US government to side with Qatar against this directive. So I understand that both have common understandings that it impacts their big companies, like Cheniere for the US or Conoco or Exxon for the US and many others. And it goes beyond the energy sector. But there are so many more differences between Qatar and the US, and they are not aligned on many of those European directives or have different interests to defend. So, for example, and I wrote a piece actually that I for CSIS on this particular topic, and I submitted my draft just a week before, so I didn't change anything when the letter came out. But I was taking the position that Europe anyway is going to show more pragmatism and water down some of its directives. But I was highlighting many of the differences between the US and Qatar. And for the
Hmm.
corporate directives, um, actually, Qatar is more concerned about the human right dimension of the sustainability directive, something that the US is not, concerned at all. And then you have other extraterritorial directives like the methane directive or the carbon border and adjustment directive that where both have different perspective too. Um, so I thought it was interesting that, and I think it's the first time the DOE is actually jointly writing a letter like this with another minister. I, oh, and also I should mention that Qatar has taken a very aggressive approach on this directive and has threatened several times Europe to curtail its exports because of this directive, which is an interesting, position. And I don't think it would be wise for the US, at any point to threaten to curtail exports. They didn't go that far in the letter, but Qatar did in the past and made some statements on this.
Yeah, I mean, if the U.S. curtailed exports over the directive, they would Henry Hub would go to zero. I mean, I don't think U.S. gas producers, that really, is in their best interest. So, I mean, I think you break down the directive into who's most vulnerable with what. I think that's right, because if this was just about meeting production standards, the Qataris actually have done a pretty good job environmentally with what they do inside of Qatar. And so the human rights issues, I think, are the real issue for them. Where with the U.S., the the production of LNG is so not integrated, and there's so many different places that you can have fugitive gas emissions along the supply chain from the field all the way to the regasification terminal, wherever that is in the world, that it would be hard to track, frankly, and hard to and really hard to sort of meet that kind of goal. I kind of agree with you. I totally agree with you. Like, I think it's all going to get watered down. I think the direction of this is headed in the other direction, because if there were any two countries in the world that could meet these standards, I would put probably Qatar and the U.S. first in line, and then every other LNG producer after them, in terms of meeting those kind of standards. So the fact that they don't see this as a commercial advantage and they see this as a detriment to them, suggests a sort of wider vulnerability for the business. I mean, at the end of the day, if Europe doesn't want to, it wants to buy less LNG based on these standards, European gas demand is going to collapse, because there's no way the prices are going to go even higher than they are now, based on the additional costs that would be imposed on the LNG, and Europe will just continue to shrink as a gas market, which would probably be really bad for the rest of the world, gas price wise. But if Europe were to go down that road, but I think Europe's going down that road anyway. I've said many times, European gas demand's been falling for 20 years. I don't think that's going to stop. I think it's going to continue, and it's just a matter of what's going to substitute in for the Russian gas that's off the market, at least for now, and probably it will, at least in total volumes for the future. So yeah, it surprised me too, and I don't think either Qatar or US has much leverage here anyway, and I think they were just kind of like announcing their presence with authority without actually having any authority
Mm.
in this case. As because we just said, Qatar has less than 15% of their exports are going to Europe, and I expect it to go to zero. So if they're not selling in the Melody LNG anyway, why do they care how Europe dictates where the LNG is going to go?
So I think for me it's a PR coup, like a
Yes,
communication
that's right.
strategy, and it plays two roles maybe. One is, as you remember, Qatar helped the US strike the ceasefire basically, and help also with the hostage release. Finally,
Yeah,
the Israeli hostages after 2 years of war. And in exchange, the US offers some security guarantees to Doha, and apologize from Prime Minister Netanyahu after the strike in Doha, and maybe disjoint later from DOE to show like a common ground and some common alliances. Or
yeah,
also, ConocoPhillips, Qatar, sorry, ConocoPhillips, Exxon, both are very involved in Qatar. They're also concerned with the directive, and they wanted to basically show that the US is backing Qatar. Because this summer, to be honest, was a nightmare for Qatar. First, they were attacked in June by Iran. I mean, the US military base was attacked by Iran in June. Also in June, Israel struck the South Pars field, one of the block in the South Pars field. And in September, Israel attacked the Hamas leadership in Doha, which basically exposed in plain sight the vulnerability of Qatar's, you know, geography and its relationships with its neighbors and groups like Hamas. So I think it was important also for companies that have huge interest and investments in Qatar to show a common alliance between the U.S. and Qatar.
yeah. I mean, listen. At the end of the day, the U.S. has 10,000 troops in Qatar. That kind of tells you, what the relationship is about. But Qatar's, influence is really based on the amount of money that they can, spread around in the U.S. and Brussels. And at the end of the day, if a foreign entity wanted to take out 100% of their LNG gas exports, it would take them probably a couple hours to do it, and they'd be gone for years. So like, they have to, obviously, they're in a very difficult position. Not very difficult, but they're in a position where they can only demand so much. and
Mm.
and I think you're right, and I think the instincts of the PR thing is right. I think this is more U.S. led than maybe Qatari led, and kind of the Qataris went along with it. I didn't think about it that way, but I think that to me, given the administration's position on how they're positioning LNG as sort of an economic foreign policy weapon, I think that makes sense the way you're explaining it.
Hmm. Very interesting. Um, well, we have so much to discuss about Qatar, but I wanted also to hear, Ira, a little bit about your personal, professional trajectory.
Really? Oh, I didn't know
Yeah.
that was coming. Okay.
So,
Uh, sure.
yeah. So,
So yeah. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I counted, but I don't want to age you. But it seems like for 30 years now, you've been an expert, a specialist, an analyst with deep experience on the energy power sector. And I was just wondering, where do you feel this job is heading now, and where are you personally at what stage? Everybody is talking about the revolution of AI, how it's going to change all our white collar job. So how do you feel about all this?
Well, so I've been, yeah, I'm going to age myself. So I've been doing this since 1989. So over 35 years. And it's been great. I didn't expect to be in the energy industry at all in any capacity. So it's been a really good place. And as you know, the business has been really, really interesting over time. And when sort of I look at like what I do for a living, and how that's going to evolve, certainly with AI and the way things are happening, I still think there's obviously room out there for when you really have good ideas and insights. And at least in my own experience with AI, is that it just allows me to gather supporting evidence for sort of an idea that I have, and helping me sort of flesh out an idea by finding all these sort of random facts that I need to support any kind of idea that I have. I certainly like on social media, as you know, when I work on Twitter, like I try and look at I come up with ideas about things like the LNG paradox, or LNG theater, which I said yesterday on Twitter. I talked about Alaska LNG being LNG theater, and my God, I can't remember the last time I hadn't gotten such a big response on something I write since Tellurian was in existence. So but it does help sort of when I think of an idea, kind of helping on the research side, getting to stuff that I can't otherwise find, quickly. Also,
So
really
wait,
helps with
so wait, so wait,
mathematical calculations. I have to say,
yes.
it's really good for doing for math, which is not my strong suit.
So for the theater tweet, what was you and what was Twitter? What was you and what was ChatGPT?
No, it was all me. It
Oh
was
yeah,
all me. So, but I was just saying that when if I'm thinking about Alaska LNG, let's say, and Trump basically mentioned it in his speech, and then everyone was shocked that he mentioned it because it evidently had nothing to do with what was being talked about the other day. But clearly, when Trump thinks about Asia, he thinks about LNG. When he thinks about LNG in China, he thinks about Alaska. You can kind of see the logical way that his mind is kind of going towards that, whether or not it had to do with the relevant thing of the moment. So then, I just on chat, like if I use chat GTP, I'm like, okay, how many of these sort of, letters of intent or memorandums of understanding has the US signed with who over the past, 9 months? Because I just can't remember off the top of my head. And so for chat GPT, it sort of, fires them up, or using the Google Gemini version of, it fires them up really fast. It provides me the sources. I can check the sources, and then it allows me to sort of write. But the theater line was 100% me.
yeah.
I was
By
going
the
to
way,
use I
yeah,
was going to use the line kabuki theater, but it's not a Japanese thing; it's a Chinese thing. So it kind of was a cultural mismatch. So I just decided to use LNG theater instead.
yeah. By the way, Chinese companies had already signed non-binding agreements in 2017 for Alaska. So
Oh, see,
almost,
there you go.
yeah,
I didn't
almost a decade ago, and nothing
exactly.
happened. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, but
I mean,
yeah,
people have been signing agreements for Alaska LNG for 40 years. This is not like a new, in other iterations of the project, not in this
yeah,
current iteration.
yes. So you're using it for a little bit of research, flesh out some ideas, and for me, I don't think, for analysts who try to anticipate trends or try to, like you did in your paper, flesh out some scenarios. I don't think, the bodies. is yet intelligence is yet there, but we'll have to always reinvent ourselves.
No, I mean, I think that's right. But it definitely has changed the way I work a bit. I have to say that having it there, it makes it easier to do background research and find sourcing than before. Now, I'm not in the forecasting business anymore like you are. I work at Columbia, so my job isn't to forecast, but to sort of point out trends that I see. And like another great one was about I had this idea like that it's really interesting that downstream companies are moving upstream and upstream companies are moving downstream in LNG. Like JERA is buying acreage and Tokyo Gas are buying acreage in the U.S. Gulf Coast, and you know, and then you know, companies like EQT are announcing that they're not only going to go into liquefaction, but they're going to get into regasification elsewhere in the world because they want to create a chain. So it really helps me look up, or kind of seek out other areas where I can sort of, fatten up the point here by other examples of where this is happening. So things like that. Because as you didn't point out that I'm getting to the age where I can't remember everything like I used to.
Great. Well, I'm very happy we managed to exchange today. And thanks for all your contributions for
Oh,
public
thank you
debate.
for having me. And
For
thank you
public
for having
debate.
me. It's I'm glad you're doing this podcast, and I look forward to talking in the future, as
Thank
always.
you. Thank you. This episode was recorded on October 31st, 2025. And this is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck. If you like what you hear, want to support Energy Vista, discuss sponsorship, or send feedback, contact me.